Alrighty, we're going to continue our class on covenant theology, covenants made simple. So I'll just review again kind of a brief summary of the class, a study of covenant theology and the biblical understanding of God's promises to his people. So that's pretty much the summary of what covenant theology is. Again, it's based on the book that we're reading, Covenants Made Simple. And the Mosaic covenant is probably one of the most difficult ones. So Ethan's not here, so I can't thank him for giving me this class. But it's probably the most difficult and probably the most controversial out of all the different covenants in covenant theology and how to understand it, even in the Reformed circles, in the circles of covenant theologians. So we'll dig into a little bit of that. Let me review very quickly, just again, the big picture of where we're at, what we're doing, why we're studying this, just so I think this, I love big pictures. You know, I love just looking in, kind of step back, what are we trying to do here? So we can say that we are looking at redemptive history. So this is what we're trying to understand. What is redemptive history? What is God doing with his people right from the beginning? Because if we view ourselves as disconnected from everything that happened in the past, then our Christianity to some degree is irrelevant. It has no connection to the larger world, the larger plan of God. And sad to say, there are many Christians that do that. They don't connect their Christianity to everything else, not just in church history, as much as we appreciate church history, but even going all the way back to the beginning of creation and Israel. So just very quickly, right in the beginning, you have the covenant of works. We talked about that. That's starting with Adam. Ethan talked about that. And actually, even before we get there, usually what I like to do is I'll do the covenant of redemption. And our book is going to get to that a little bit later. He doesn't start with covenant of redemption, but because it's actually kind of a not all covenant theologians will agree on whether it is an actual covenant and how we should view it. But covenant of redemption, the best way to think about it is it entails the whole redemptive history. So this was introduced by the Puritans. It wasn't necessarily something that was introduced by early Reformed theologians, but the Puritans are the ones who really brought this out, this whole concept of before God creates, there was an inner Trinitarian relationship and dialogue, we can say, between the Trinity, and they established this covenant of redemption, which is pretty much, hey, we're going to create a people, what are we going to do with them? That's pretty much what the covenant of redemption is. It entails the whole redemption history. Then we have the covenant of Noah, and then you have the covenant of Abraham, and then you have the covenant of Moses, which is where we find ourselves today. So we talked about the covenant of works, covenant of Noah, the Noahic covenant. Last time we talked about the covenant of Abraham, the Abrahamic covenant, and that's where kind of the technically speaking, that's where the covenant of grace begins. So you can look at I usually like to do it this way, where you have the covenant of Noah, I believe, is under the umbrella of the covenant of grace, but it's not until we get to Abraham that really the details of that redemption begin to be explained. So that's kind of that whole concept of the covenant of grace. And then after that, you have the covenant with David, so the Davidic covenant, which will be next time, and then you have the new covenant. And that kind of, that's where we are today as the people of God. So we're right here. We're in the new covenant, and we're trying to look back and understand how all of this fits in terms of redemptive history. What is God doing? And the big theme where covenant theology stands out and is unique is covenant theology recognized that the best way to categorize all of these different biblical covenants is with the concept of grace. God is graciously doing something with his people. God is graciously redeeming his people. So before we get in, I wanted to do just a quick book suggestions and also just sources on what I'm relying a lot on. So obviously our book that we're reading, there's a part of my seminary class was a class on covenant theology. It was by Ligon Duncan, and you can actually listen to it for free. You can download the Reformed Theological Seminary app, and the whole class is for free. And if you want to dig into it a lot more, Ligon Duncan does a phenomenal job just really looking into covenant theology. So I was dependent a lot just on his notes and information. And then two books also that are phenomenal, just to dig in a little bit more, is Richard Belcher, The Fulfillment of the Promises of God, an explanation of covenant theology. And then, because I'm a Reformed Baptist, I had to bring a Baptist in. The Mystery of Christ, His Covenant and His Kingdom, Samuel Renahan. You can look at it afterwards. But our book is a great introduction, but if you want to dig in a little bit more, there's a lot of good books on there, especially the Richard Belcher one. I found that one very useful because he covers a lot of ground, but it's very easy to read. It's not anything that you're going to walk away with and scratch your head, go, what in the world is going on? What did I just read? So I was dependent a lot on these different sources, and I would strongly recommend them if you want to dig into more of this. So we're in chapter 5 in our book, The Mosaic Covenant. I think our author refers to it as Moses and covenant obedience. So there is different understandings on how we even should categorize and understand and the whole concept of the Mosaic Covenant. So there is one, I would almost say, mainstream popular way of understanding it in mainstream America is the classical dispensational. And then, so this is going back to the beginning of dispensationalism, but then there's also different waves of that, of where dispensationalism has progressed. But in terms of classical dispensationalism, and I don't think you're going to find a whole lot of like real hardcore classical dispensationalists, but just to show the difference, they look at the Mosaic Covenant strictly in terms of, in the context of discontinuity. So these are terminology you'll hear a lot, is the whole concept of continuity and discontinuity. So when we read Scripture, you read the Old Testament, how much of the Old Testament, how much of the themes of the Old Testament get carried into the New Testament? How much of it is discontinued? How much of it is continued? So that's, I think, a very helpful way of thinking about this. And it's a somewhat recently that theologians have started talking about in these types of categories, which I think is very helpful, where you're not necessarily doing these strict system divisions of dispensational covenant theologian, because there's so many different broad spectrums in that. You're really beginning to look at the individual themes in redemptive history. What continues? What doesn't continue? So classical dispensationalism will very strongly look at the Mosaic Covenant and place it in the context of discontinuity. There's strong emphasis placed on this language of unconditional and conditional. And one way that they will make a very stark difference and division between the Abrahamic covenant and the Mosaic covenant is Abrahamic covenant is unconditional. The Mosaic covenant is conditional in terms of its foundation. And I actually think that's a really bad way to look at it, because every covenant has elements of it that is conditional and unconditional. Every covenant. There's no such thing as a purely unconditional covenant, because there's always something that is demanded. Even when we think about our salvation is based on works, on Christ's works, not ours. So there is a conditional aspect, even in the whole aspect, even in redemptive covenant and in the covenant of grace. So it's I think it's a false division to strictly look at the Mosaic covenant and say, oh, this is strictly just a conditional covenant. It's just Israel trying to earn their salvation. That's what it would be. And it's funny. So Schofield, the traditional classical dispensationalist guy, and I tried hard to find a picture of this, but I think they did a good job hiding this. So the original Schofield Bible, I believe it was like 1909, it actually had a note in there in Exodus chapter 19, verse 8, and we'll read that passage later on, where God says, I'm going to give the law, and Israel says, we will submit to God. I'm summarizing. And Schofield actually says that was a mistake. They shouldn't have done that. They actually should have rejected the law. And we see, so this is a quote from him from a book he did, Rightly Dividing the Word of Truth. In the wilderness of Sinai, God proposed to them the covenant of law. Instead of humbly pleading for a continued relation of grace, they presumptuously answered, all that the Lord has spoken we will do. Those are fascinating words when you think about it. Because what he is saying, what classical dispensationalism is saying, is when God brought the law to Israel, they should have said, no, we don't want this. We want to stick with Abraham's unconditional covenant. What that completely misses the point is the fact that the Mosaic covenant stems out of the Abrahamic covenant. It is a covenant of grace in terms of its foundation. So classical dispensationalism is kind of one extreme, we can say, of how to look at the Mosaic covenant. How do we understand the Mosaic covenant? And again, like I said, there's other forms of dispensationalism that would not agree with this. So I'm kind of looking at more of just like the classical extreme example. There's progressive dispensationalism and things like that would not go this far. When we enter into the Reformed camp, Reformed covenant theology, there is also a distinction and disagreement on how to view the Mosaic covenant. And that's why this covenant is probably the most controversial out of all of them. And our author in the book touched on this. He just used different terminology to explain it. And I forget now what he used, but some like same girl but different. I forget what he said in the book but that's what he's talking about here. So the first one is what's referred to as the republication theory. So this actually it has some big names behind it, but it is clearly this is very much so the minority view. But you have a Puritan giant like John Owen who actually taught this. In modern times, it became very popular with Meredith Kline is one individual, and then in our time, somebody like Michael Horton, if you heard of him, he's a student of Meredith Kline. And what this view does is they look at the Mosaic covenant and they link it to the covenant of works. What they say is it's not a covenant of grace. It goes back to the covenant of works. So they'll use terminology like in some sense. So the Mosaic covenant in some sense is a covenant of works. They'll also say that Abraham, so this is a paraphrase from Michael Horton's book, but he says the Abrahamic covenant, so Abraham's seed runs through David. Mosaic covenant is national and conditional. So it does not run through the Abrahamic covenant. It doesn't run through the covenant of grace. Now, what's interesting with this is, and this is just me speaking, the individuals where this view is popular stems a lot from Westminster Escondino. And if you remember, that's where we talked about when we critiqued radical two-kingdom theology. And I can see where radical two-kingdom theology stems from this understanding of the Mosaic covenant, because they would view a much stricter discontinuity between the Mosaic covenant and us today. And we'll make one point of application on that, where I think it will make a little more sense. And then so this is the majority view. This is kind of the classical Reformed understanding of how do we understand Moses' covenant. And that is that the Mosaic covenant is under the umbrella of covenant of grace. It is inherently a covenant of grace. And we're going to make an argument for that. I'm going to focus a lot of our time just trying to understand that point and trying to prove that point from Scripture. And one application of this disagreement, we can say, is the proper understanding of the uses of God's law. So what happens is, so there are three uses of God's law. If you're not familiar with it, this is kind of classic Reformed theology. The Reformers looked at God's law and they said, how does it apply? How do we understand it? The first use is the civil use. So it's used in the civil realm for the nation of Israel, and that's how it was used at that time. The second use is the salvific use. So that's kind of that concept of it's a tutor that leads us to Christ. And then the third use is, I just call it the sanctifying use. So it's a guide for the believer. So what happens is those individuals that look at the Mosaic covenant strictly in the realm of the covenant of works, they will diminish the third use of the law very much so. And if you read Meredith Kline, he does that a lot. So they'll make a strong emphasis on it's a tutor that leads us to Christ. There's going to be a very small emphasis on it is a guide for us as believers. Versus the covenant of grace theory, we can say, so somebody like John Murray would be very much so on the opposite side, but he'll tend to kind of not be soft on the second use, where a good balance is when we look at the Mosaic covenant, we look at the law that God gave, we have to look at all of these uses and view them as important and valuable and balance them in our own life. So the law, and we'll talk more about this as we go on, so the law has a civil use. We'll try to explain that a little bit more. The law has a salvific use. It is a tutor that leads us to Christ. But when you're a believer, you don't need to just be stuck on that second use. There's a third use that's beautiful, that it's a guide that leads you as a believer on how to walk. So that's kind of an application where I think this distinction becomes evident, is how do we view God's law and where will we make the emphasis? And I think the best way to understand the Mosaic covenant, and our author in the book argues for this, is it is under the umbrella of the covenant of grace, and all of these uses should wonderfully flow out of God's law in terms of how we view it, how we read it, and more importantly, how we apply it. So let's look at the foundation of the Mosaic covenant. And this is where I want to kind of begin to make that argument of where the Mosaic covenant is best understood under the umbrella of the covenant of grace. If you go to Exodus chapter 1, we'll be looking at different passages. So right in the beginning, before we even get to Exodus 20, which is the actual giving of the law, or the beginning of the giving of the law, you see certain themes that show up. And specifically, what you first see is creation mandate themes. So Exodus chapter 1, verse 7. But the sons of Israel were fruitful and increased and multiplied and became exceedingly mighty, so that the land was filled with them. What do you think of when you read that? Hopefully, at least one thought is you have the creation mandate, be fruitful and multiply. You have that same creation mandate that is repeated, if you remember, in the Noahic covenant, be fruitful and multiply. You have that same creation mandate which is picked up in the Abrahamic covenant, where I will make a great nation out of you. So this concept of multiplication. Another, you can look at verse 9, and he said to his people, behold, the people of the son of Israel are more and mightier than we. So this concept of being great. Come, let us deal wisely with them, lest they multiply and it be in the event of war, that they also join themselves to those who hate us. Verse 12, but the more they afflicted them, the more they multiplied, and the more they spread out, so that they were in dread of the sons of Israel. And then last one, verse 20, so God was good to the midwives, and the people multiplied and became very mighty. So you begin to see, as you enter into Exodus, you begin to see this concept of creation mandate themes are picked up again. And what this demonstrates is that there is a continuation with the covenant promises. So God's not restarting something. God's not even ignoring what he already did with Abraham and saying, okay, well, let me set Abraham aside for a little bit here. Let me go all the way back to Adam pre-fall and maybe try this again with the nation of Israel. No, what you're seeing is you're seeing this continuation of the covenant promises. And it's seen, I think, in a very small way in the creation mandate themes that are picked up. The next thing that you see is this whole theme of deliverance. So there's this whole concept of God is delivering his people. So again, you can go all the way back to the beginning, trace through the covenants, through the story, and there's always this concept of deliverance. Right after the fall, you have the gospel statement is given, Genesis 3:15. God is going to deliver by crushing. In the Noahic covenant, you have God delivering Noah and his family, and you have in the creation mandate restated. In Abraham, you have the same thing. God chooses Abraham, picks him, and this concept of deliverance is picked up as the Abrahamic covenant begins to develop. And now you come to Israel, and you can almost say this is the ultimate picture of deliverance when Israel is in a nation as slaves and they are delivered. So I think also in that you see this continuation of grace as you begin to enter into this covenant, the narrative where we see this covenant. The next thing is you see the unity of God's covenantal purposes. So there's interesting statement at the end of Exodus chapter 2, verses 23 and 25. Now it happened in the course of those many days that the king of Egypt died. So I think most of us are probably familiar with, the overall story that's taken place here. And the sons of Israel sighed because of the slavery, and they cried out, and their cry for help because of their slavery rose up to God. So God heard their groaning, and God remembered his covenant with Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob, and God saw that the sons of Israel and God knew them. Why did God respond to their groaning? It wasn't just that he felt bad because of their cry. What drove God's response is his covenantal promises that he made to Abraham. And I think this is the greatest link of when we look at the Mosaic covenant, it is put and placed in the context of the Abrahamic covenant, in the context of grace. So God looks at his people and he says, I will respond to deliver you because of the covenantal promises that I made to Abraham. You see this beautiful continuity in God's working in history of redemption. Also in Exodus 3, verses 15 and 16, and God furthermore said to Moses, "Thus you shall say to the sons of Israel, Yahweh, the God of your fathers, the God of Abraham, the God of Isaac, and the God of Jacob, has sent me to you. This is my name forever, and this is my memorial name from generation to generation. Go and gather the elders of Israel together and say to them, Yahweh, the God of your fathers, the God of Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob, has appeared to me, saying, I indeed care about you and what has been done to you in Egypt." Again, you have this restatement of God is saying, Moses is asking, what should I tell them? How are they going to know? What does he do? He takes them right back to the Abrahamic covenant. He takes them back to their forefathers and says, they will know because you will tell them that I have come to deliver you based upon the promises of the covenant that I made with Abraham. So again, this Mosaic covenant needs to be viewed in the context of grace, in the context of the Abrahamic covenant. And then also in Genesis 15, it's kind of, you link the prophecy in Genesis 15. We won't go there, but remember, that's when God tells Abraham that when he initially makes the covenant, this treaty, when he puts Abraham to sleep, he says, your seed will be in a foreign nation as slaves for 400 years. So right in the Abrahamic covenant, you have a direct link that takes us right to the Mosaic covenant. So what does this mean? What this means is when we look at the Mosaic covenant, when we read the covenant that God made with Moses, when we read the law, we should view this as God is extending and expanding the Abrahamic covenant through the Mosaic covenant in his historical and theological outworking of the covenant of grace. So again, go back kind of to our big picture. You have the covenant of grace and God, and these are the individual, if we can use the word dispensation, these are the individual dispensations in the covenant of grace where God is working with his people. So we see continuity here. So we should not view the Mosaic covenant in its foundation as a covenant of discontinuity, something that is disconnected from God's overall plan of redemption. It is something that is directly connected to God's plan of redemption. Next thing I want to talk about is the nature of the Mosaic covenant. So how should we just think about this covenant? And I think the best way to do this is to go to Exodus 19. So before we get to 20, let's spend a little time in Exodus 19. And this is the, you can almost kind of call it the preparation. God is preparing Moses and the people of God for receiving the law, which is going to happen in Exodus chapter 20. So Exodus 19, verses 1 and 2, we have the giving of the law. And in the 3rd month after the sons of Israel had gone out of the land of Egypt, on this day they came into the wilderness of Sinai. Then they set out from Rephidim and came to the wilderness of Sinai and camped in the wilderness. And there Israel camped in front of the mountain. Now, what's interesting about this passage is this provides kind of the setting, both the historical setting of the giving of the law that's going to take place, but I think it also provides kind of the theological setting, because what's interesting here, if you think about it from a chronological perspective, it took them about 50 years to get to this point, but actually the rest of what takes place in Exodus, all of Leviticus, and a good portion of Numbers takes place here. And they're going to be here for about a year. So this is kind of an important setting introduction, that a good portion of their time is going to be spent here at the foot of the mountain of the giving of the law. Verses 3 and 4, we see the redemptive prologue of the law. Now Moses went up to God, and Yahweh called to him from the mountain, saying, Thus you shall say to the house of Jacob, and tell the sons of Israel, You yourselves have seen what I did to the Egyptians, and how I lifted you up on eagle's wings and brought you to myself. Now, this is where we see this whole concept of deliverance. So, what God is saying here, when he comes to Israel, he's about to give his law. He doesn't look at Israel and say, here's my law, do what it says, and I'll deliver you. No, what he says is, I have already delivered you. I have already brought you from the land of Egypt into this place, and now I am about to give you my law. Now that's an important theme, because this introduces, again, this whole concept of grace and redemption and deliverance. And I think it demonstrates, again, this whole idea of continuity, the flow of God's redemptive work. Verses 5 and 6, it says, So now then, so based on this whole idea of deliverance, I delivered you, I brought you here. So now then, if you will indeed listen to my voice and keep my covenant, then you shall be my treasured possession among all the peoples, for all the earth is mine. And you shall be to me a kingdom of priests and a holy nation. These are the words that you shall speak to the sons of Israel. Now here, God introduces obligations. But these obligations are put in contrast, but together with blessing. So the blessing is this whole idea of, I brought you here, I delivered you, I brought you to myself, so now I will give you my law, I will give you obligations. But and they're stated together. And what's interesting about this whole concept is these are the exact themes that are picked up by Peter in 1 Peter chapter 2, verse 9. We're not going to go there, but if you remember, Peter takes this same language and applies it to the new covenant community, to the new covenant church. And I think what this does is it demonstrates, again, this whole idea of God's continuing plan of redemption through all of history. So again, we shouldn't view the Mosaic covenant as something that it's just a bunch of laws that these people had to follow in order for them to be saved, in order for them to be delivered. That's not how we should view the Mosaic covenant. The Mosaic covenant is placed in the context of deliverance, in the context of grace, stemming and flowing and expanding the Abrahamic covenant. And even the language that's used here, I think, demonstrates that. And then in verses 7 and 9, Israel ratifies the covenant. So Moses came and called the elders of the people and said before them all these words which Yahweh had commanded him. And all the people answered together and said, all that Yahweh has spoken we will do. And Moses brought back the words of the people to Yahweh. Yahweh said to Moses, behold, I will come to you in a thick cloud, so that the people may hear when I speak with you, and may also believe in you forever. Then Moses told the words of the people to Yahweh. And this is where Schofield makes that reference of where Israel should have rejected. They shouldn't have accepted the law. They should have said, no, thank you, take us back to Abraham. And I think that misses the point of what's going on. Now, there is a unique aspect of the law. So there is something unique about the Mosaic covenant where it brings condemnation, but it also brings blessing. And this is where that whole concept of the second use of the law and the third use of the law becomes a reality. And Paul picks up on this in Romans chapter 10. It's a difficult passage, and this is where... This is the verse that leads to some of the controversy on how do we understand the Mosaic covenant. So this is where, let's read verse 5, Romans 10:5. For Moses writes about the righteousness which is of law, the man who does these things shall live by them. But the righteousness of faith speaks in this way. Do not say in your heart, who will go up into heaven, that is to bring Christ down, or who will go down into the abyss, that is to bring Christ up from the dead. So the first one is a quote from Leviticus chapter 18. The second one is a quote from Deuteronomy chapter 30. So the whole discussion is, Paul here is pinning the righteousness of the law against the righteousness of faith. How do we understand that? And therefore, the position that would link the Mosaic covenant to the covenant of works, not place it under the covenant of grace, would say, well, that's what it's referring to there. But I think, again, that misses the point a little bit of the uniqueness of this covenant, of how this covenant has condemnation, but it also has blessings. So the blessings is the obedience flows out of redemption. The condemnation is that disobedience flows out of corruption. So it flows out of a corrupt heart. And I think that takes you right back to Romans chapter 9 of, remember when Paul makes that amazing and confusing statement, not all who are Israel are Israel? Well, that's a phenomenal statement because that gives us the proper framework upon which to understand a lot of these themes. Those in Israel for whom the law became a condemnation demonstrated their corruption. Those in Israel for whom the law became a blessing demonstrated their true redemption, which was pointing forward to Christ. And that's where you have that second and third use of the law. So the law is a tutor that brings us to Christ. And then the third use is the law is a guide for us as believers. So God's sovereignty is seen in the disobedience of Israel, thus leading to curses in the continuation of his covenant of grace. Thus the types and shadows becomes the antitypes and the realities. So when we look at the law was not an experiment on God's part. Okay, let me try this again. Oh, it didn't work. Okay, let me go back to what I told Abraham, and now I'll do it through David. That's not how we should view the Mosaic covenant. We should view it in the context of God's sovereignty, in His grace, where God is working through His people in bringing about a certain redemption. And the covenant of Moses, specifically the law, it's continuing the covenant of grace through types and through shadows. And I think that's what the book of Hebrews specifically demonstrates. I was going to read Belcher has a good paragraph on that. I don't think we'll have time, but if anyone's interested after the class, I can point you to that paragraph. So, if we simplify this whole concept, continuity between the Abrahamic covenant and the Mosaic covenant, I think simply put, is seen in Abrahamic covenant, who am I? Mosaic covenant, how should I then live? And that covers these different uses of God's law. If the Mosaic covenant, if the covenant is a blessing upon you, then it demonstrates the fact that it is a blessing because of your deliverance, because of the faith. One last point on this. So there's discontinuity in the covenant. So there's also an aspect, again, in this whole idea of it being a covenant, of it being a curse, but also a condemnation and a blessing, and the uniqueness of the law. So there is an aspect of discontinuity in this covenant, in that it was designed as a type and shadow of the reality and the fulfillment to come. There's a phenomenal passage in Hebrews chapter 12. I'll just read it. Verses 18 to the end of the chapter. For you have not come to a mountain that can be touched. So this is exactly where we're at here. Exodus 19, Exodus 20. For you have not come to a mountain that can be touched, and to a blazing fire, and to darkness and gloom and whirlwind, and to the blast of a trumpet and the sound of words, which was such that those who heard begged that no further word be spoken to them. For they could not bear what was being commanded. If even a beast touches the mountain, it will be stoned. And so terrible was what happened that Moses said, I am full of fear and trembling. So this is the Sinaitic covenant. This is the covenant being given. That's the context in which it is given. But you have come to Mount Zion. So he's looking to the new covenant community. You have come to Mount Zion and to the city of the living God, the heavenly Jerusalem, and to myriads of angels, to the festal gathering and assembly of the firstborn who are enrolled in heaven, and to God, the judge of all, and to the spirits of the righteous made perfect, and to Jesus, the mediator of a new covenant, and to the sprinkled blood which speaks better than the blood of Abel. So in some way, what the description here is, this is what happens every Sunday morning. When the people of God corporately gather, this is what happens. It's a rich passage when you dig into all of the different ramifications. But I think this passage demonstrates some of that discontinuity that takes place between, as God is revealing His grace, His covenant of grace, through the different dispensations. This is the discontinuity that takes place in the Mosaic covenant, where it was something that wasn't supposed to be final. It was something that just had shadows and types, not the actual reality. It's something that pointed to Christ, who is the actual reality. It's something that pointed to the new heaven and the new Jerusalem and the new earth, not the actual new heaven and the new earth and the new Jerusalem. So I think that passage kind of helps us a little bit in seeing that. A few points, just kind of looking at specifics of the law. So we have the sacrificial system of the law. So the Mosaic covenant did not bring about a change of heart. It produced the system upon which sins can be forgiven as a type of the ultimate sacrifice. And I think this is the aspect of the old covenant which is lesser and deficient for the people of God. So in Jeremiah chapter 31, where you have these statements, I will give you a new covenant, not like the covenant I made before. God is not there discrediting everything that he did in the past. All he's saying is, it is not the covenant that I made with Moses, which was of types and shadows. No, I'm going to give you now the actual reality, which is Christ, which is a changed heart. So I think that's important to see also when we look at the discontinuity between the Mosaic covenant and us today in the new covenant, in terms of God's redemptive plan, kind of God's big picture redemptive plan. And then I list also Hebrews chapter 9 and 10, I think also brings this out. Another aspect, again, is the civil aspect of the Mosaic law. So how do we understand this? Well, I think, again, there's discontinuity, there's continuity. So there is discontinuity in the application of these laws, since the promise of the land has been fulfilled in the universal and spiritual realities in the new covenant. And there's some great passages in how the apostles apply. So 1 Corinthians 5 is interesting. So they take that whole concept of purging the evil among you. So Paul there takes that concept, but those who are outside God will judge. Remove the wicked man from among yourselves. So this passage, 1 Corinthians 5:13, that was the context in the law that was given for capital punishment. So Paul takes that whole idea and applies it to the church in the context of church discipline and excommunication. So I think that partly demonstrates this level of discontinuity in how we look at the Mosaic covenant and apply it to our day today. But there is continuity in the application of these laws for a number of reasons. For the laws are a manifestation of God's moral being. So the law perfectly and wonderfully show us God's moral being, what God demands. It's summarized in the Ten Commandments, but then it's shown in greater detail in examples through all of the individual laws that are given in the rest of Exodus and Leviticus and Numbers and Deuteronomy. They're placed in opposition to the acts of the other nations. So when you read the law, you come across these interesting statements that say, do not be like the nations who were here before that I removed because they did not do this. So there's an aspect in which this law was not just meant for Israel, because God says that if the other nations would have obeyed this moral concept, I wouldn't have chased them out. And that's that famous passage that has to do a lot with today, with the whole idea of homosexuality and LGBTQ. I believe Leviticus 18 or Leviticus 20, where God takes this whole idea of what is the sexual norm for God's people and for the nation, and he places it in a universal context and says the other nations did not do this, therefore I removed them. So there is an aspect of this law that's placed in opposition to the acts of the other nations. Now, combine that with the aspect that it's given to a nation who is to be a light to all the other nations. So Israel was to take the law and be a light to all the other nations. So if the other nation comes to Israel and says, we're blown away at how prosperous you are, what do? What do you think Israel's going to say? Do you think they're going to go, well, I mean, here's some, generic little few things, just be wise? No, they're going to give them the law because it is the light. They are the light for the other nations. And then the last thing is, it's applied by the apostles as a standard for those outside the church. So 1 Timothy chapter 1, I think, brings this out probably the most clearly. 1 Timothy chapter 1, verse 8. But we know that the law is good if one uses it lawfully. Knowing this, that law is not made for a righteous person, but for those who are lawless and rebellious, for the ungodly and sinners, for the unholy and godless, for those who kill their fathers or mothers, for murderers, for sexually immoral persons, for homosexuals, for kidnappers, for liars, for perjurers, and whatever else is contrary to sound teaching, according to the gospel of the glory of the blessed God with which I have been entrusted. So most interpreters understand that this passage, Paul is actually just listing the 10 Commandments. But he's listing them and applying them to those who are outside the church. The law is not made for a righteous person. So Paul would have looked at his culture, at his nation, those outside the church, and he would have said, here is your standard. It's God's law. It's God's moral law. That's your standard. And then I think Romans 13 also brings that out, but we don't have time to get into that. So I put in chapter 19 of the London Baptist Confession, because we all know it's superior to the Westminster. But I'm just joking, they're both amazing. But chapter 19 on the law of God, I printed that out for you. It's, read through that because I think it wonderfully kind of summarizes a lot of the things that we talked about in terms of how do we view the law of God, how do we view the Mosaic covenant and the law that's produced out of that, how does it apply to us. We don't have time to read some of these points. I think paragraph 6 is really good also on that. But we'll end it there, and then I'll just open up the floor